Well, I haven't done this in a while, but I haven't really learned anything about PowerPoint from John other than his look really nice, and figure it takes more work than I'm capable of. So I'm still using the same old PowerPoints that I used before. You either liked them or you didn't, or you were just like whatever. So, but it is what it is. Appreciate Stephen reading the passage for us this evening. And I want us to focus our attention on this passage. Some things that I was reading recently about it, and some thoughts that a gentleman had in a book that a kind sister shared with me, really got me to thinking about this passage a lot more, and wanted to share some of those thoughts with you. And some of it will be apologetic in nature. I'm going to talk a little bit about some aspects that are apologetic, and then I want us to hopefully make some good practical applications of this passage. It's really an interesting passage. Jesus is, of course, fascinating to learn more and more about, and to look at the ways in which he interacted with his disciples. And there are some aspects of what Jesus does in this story that I think we may look at and think are unique. They might be rare, but the aspect that I think we often focus on is not really unique to Jesus. And we can see other examples of what Jesus does in this particular story, one aspect of it, in some other stories, biblically speaking, and perhaps you've even known of people in their own experiences that you're familiar with who have done similarly. But there is some aspect of Jesus that is clearly different than anybody else these people had ever seen. And it sparks a question that I think is important for us to think on, and certainly one that hopefully led them to a closer walk with him. Jesus, as was frequently the case, had been teaching in a region on one side of the Sea of Galilee, and as it becomes night, he decides that he wants the disciples and himself to get into a boat and go to the other side of the sea. They're going to travel across the sea during the night so that he can be on the other side for whatever it is. In Luke 5, we know in this particular instance, it's him casting out the demons, the legion. But Jesus is moving from one side of the sea to the other so that he can prepare for the next day. And so he and his disciples get into a boat, and a lot of times when Jesus will steal away from the crowds, the multitudes, he goes up in the mountains to pray. On this particular occasion, Jesus goes into the boat, goes to the stern, and Luke's account tells us that he finds a cushion, and he lays down, and he goes to sleep. And he must be sleeping really soundly. I've been accused of perhaps being able to sleep through a tornado or an earthquake. Jesus seems to be able to sleep really deeply on this particular occasion, and so he falls asleep on the boat. And as they sail across the sea, the dreaded happens. I want you, as you think about this story, and I think this is important in a lot of reading of biblical things, that we try as much as possible to put ourselves in the situation that's going on, and to think about where they are, what's happening, and in this particular instance, to think about who's with Jesus or who Jesus is with. They're sailing across the Sea of Galilee, and what happens is a storm, a great windstorm, Luke describes it, arises, which was something that everybody who's ever been out on the water is afraid of. Sometimes storms come without warning, and certainly that was the case with the Sea of Galilee. And so as much as possible, a sailor will avoid these kinds of conditions. But as they're sailing, I want you to think about the fact that this is not just a crew of people who've never been on the sea before. This group includes Peter and Andrew and James and John, who were skilled fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. This was certainly not the first storm they had ever encountered as they were out on the sea. And so they were familiar with the sea. They were familiar with the conditions of the sea. They were familiar with what to do when difficult conditions arose. And yet, as we look at the story, they're all afraid, terrified of what's going on. They're afraid of this particular storm because it is of such great ferocity. It's so severe that the waves are breaking into the boat, and Luke describes it as the boat is beginning to fill up. And so they're scared. And as the boat is filling, the disciples are no doubt doing everything that they can. I don't know how they were bailing the water. I don't know how those old fishing boats worked. But they're trying to do everything that they can to keep the boat afloat so that they can get the rest of the way across the sea. And all the while, Jesus is sleeping soundly in the stern of the boat. And this is the aspect that I said we look at and we think, well, this is unique that Jesus could sleep through such a horrific storm. But we've known of people who have experienced things and have been able to sleep really deeply in the midst of it. I don't know whether he was really tired, but we could come up with all kinds of ways to explain how it is that in the midst of such a ferocious storm, Jesus is asleep. I have my theories, you may have your own, but that's where he is. We see other examples of this in the Bible, even Acts chapter 12, for example. James is beheaded. Herod imprisons Peter, and the night before his trial, in which he is expecting to be executed, where do we find Peter? The passage tells us, again, it's Luke who's recording it, that he is asleep between two soldiers. And he seems to be in such a deep sleep that when the angel arouses him and helps him to escape, Peter thinks, well, maybe this is just a dream. And so again, we see Peter asleep in that particular instance. But Jesus is sleeping. That's where he is. The disciples go and wake him up. And when they wake him up, they ask him a question. And this was one of the statements that I read in the book that I thought was intriguing. And the more that I thought about it, I thought he may be right. He may be onto something here. It's really less of a question, perhaps, and more of an accusation. We read it according to what Luke writes. Teacher, do you not care, verse 38, that we are perishing? Well, number one, they're not dead yet. But the other thing is they say, teacher, do you not care that we're in such a horrible situation? The gentleman that wrote this particular book said what they're really saying is, Lord, your sleeping means you don't care that we're dying, that we're about to drown here on this boat. And so it was more of an accusation than a question, perhaps. My question as we look at this particular part of this account is, how often do we do the same thing? How often do we, during trials, whether it's the death of a loved one, I think I've mentioned this a number of times, as we move past the death of a loved one, frequently the way that people respond to that is different. It's certainly different within a congregational setting. My closeness to your loved one is certainly different than yours. But perhaps the harder part is even in the midst of the same family, when siblings lose a mother or father, and their response to the death of that mother or father is different. Or perhaps it's parents who lose a child, and the response of the father is different than that of the mother. Frequently, when those kinds of things happen, the way that we interpret that is that your different way of grieving them, if that's how you want to put it, is that you really don't care about them the way that I do. And so the disciples here in this particular instance, because Jesus is asleep in the stern while they're working frantically to stay afloat, Jesus must not care about them, and he must not care about the predicament. What's worse than the fact that we sometimes accuse each other of that is we look at God in the same way the psalmists did frequently, and we think, if God doesn't take away this trial, or if God doesn't answer this prayer in the way that I've asked him to, then it's evidence that God doesn't care about me. We probably, most of us wouldn't go so far as to say God doesn't exist. We would just say, well, God doesn't care about me. God's not interested in the circumstances or situation that I'm going through. And we have to be careful about that. Did Jesus care that they were in the middle of a storm. I'm not going to go so far as to say that they were perishing, because the reality is that Jesus' sleep wasn't a sign of a lack of concern. It perhaps was just a recognition of his lack of fear. You see, Jesus was privy to something in a lot of ways that they were not. Jesus knew how his life was going to end, and he knew it wasn't going to be in a boat in the middle of a storm in the Sea of Galilee. So Jesus knew this wasn't going to be his end. He didn't have to worry about, as they traveled across the sea, that something might arise and something might happen, that ultimately the boat would capsize and they would all drown. He knew he was going to make it to the other side of the shore. He knew there were still aspects of his mission to fulfill, and ultimately that his death was going to be on a cross. Jesus knew all of that. The reality is, even though they didn't know all of those things, they did at this point, I believe, claim that they had some understanding of who he is. But the reality is, if they had really known who he is, they wouldn't have been as afraid as they were on this particular occasion. I mean, even if all they thought was he is the Messiah, and we look at the way that the Jews misinterpreted all of that information, their belief that ultimately he was the descendant of David who was going to reestablish David's throne in Jerusalem and reignite the kingdom of Israel, if they even viewed it in that physical sense, they would have realized he can't die here, and if he's not going to die here, then the likelihood is we're going to survive too. And so as Jesus wakes up, one of the things that he says after calming the storm is, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" Now, they did have some faith. They had some understanding of who he is. But Jesus doesn't say, "Why is your faith so small here?" He says, "Why do you have no faith?" I think he's pointing to the specific situation. Why is it that you're so afraid and have no faith on this occasion? No faith in me, no faith in my ability to do something about this. And we have to be careful that in the midst of the struggles and difficulties of life, in the midst of our suffering and grief or whatever it is that we experience, that we don't demonstrate a lack of faith in God's compassion and concern for us and in God's ability to deal with it. Now, the problem arises in the fact that we want to, we want God to do it our way. We want the prayer to be answered the way that we want it to be answered. And that's all well and good. I mean, I think that's completely natural. We see, again, example after example of that in the Bible. But what we have to do is learn to trust that God sees, that God knows, that God cares, and that God will provide. How will he provide? I don't know. I don't know all the ways that God even can provide in a specific set of circumstances. But one thing I have become aware of more and more as I've gone through my life, the 47 and a half years or whatever that I've been alive, is that frequently, even when the prayer is not answered the way I anticipated or hoped, ultimately God's answer ends up being better than I could have ever imagined anyway. And so one of the things we have to do is grow in our faith to the point that we learn to trust in God enough to believe that God has this. Just like he's had every other thing that's gone on in my life. Just like he's had every other thing that's gone on in the world. God has this. God has not been removed from his throne. God, unlike Elijah accused the idols of the pagans, is not asleep. He's not busy relieving himself or doing some other task that's keeping him too busy to be concerned about you. God knows what you're going through. God knows what we're experiencing, and God cares about that. Jesus cared about what was going on with the disciples too. They just needed to learn that. So Jesus wakes up, and in addition to rebuking them for their small faith, or for their no faith, and for being afraid on this particular occasion, Jesus, with just a word, calms the storm. He says the words, "Peace, be still." It shouldn't really surprise us that Jesus calms the storm with a word. Because if we understand the Bible correctly, then it was by God's word through Jesus, John 1:1, that the whole world was created. And so it was by the word that God spoke through Jesus that everything came into being. So it's no surprise to us, or it shouldn't be any surprise to us, that with the word, Jesus simply says to the sea, I think it's interesting Luke's way of wording this through the Holy Spirit in verse 39. He awoke and he rebuked the wind. He rebuked the wind. We typically think of rebuke as being something we do to people, but Jesus rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the text goes on to say, and the wind ceased and there was a great calm. I think it's significant too that it says there was a great calm. I don't know how many of you have spent any time out on a boat on any kind of body of water. It could be as small as a lake. But if you've ever been out on a lake or a larger body of water, when a storm arises, frequently the waves get up before the storm gets there. The waves are whatever they are while the storm is there, and then they continue for some time after the storm passes. But on this occasion, this windstorm arises, and the sea is churned into a fury, such that the disciples are terrified. And they go and wake Jesus up, and when he wakes up, all he does is say, "Peace, be still," and immediately, not only does the storm go away, I don't know about you, I've not always had the best imagination when I read a book, but it gets a little more vivid as I get older. I picture the storm ending, the stars coming out, because, it was dark there. They didn't have light pollution like we do. The stars coming out, and the sea, or the Sea of Galilee, the lake, being as calm as glass. That's what I picture. And so it stops immediately and becomes completely calm. And then, as I said, he also rebukes them for their lack of faith. But the sea becomes completely calm. The storm is gone, and the sea is calm, and the danger is past. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you look at the text, they were scared of the storm. They were scared that they were going to drown in the midst of the storm. Jesus says, verse 39, "Peace, be still," and the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And then he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another. So I want you to think about this a little bit for a moment. They were afraid of the storm. Jesus calms the storm and stills the sea. You would think now is the occasion for elation. They should be overjoyed and rejoicing and just ecstatic about what's happened. And instead, what Luke tells us is they were afraid of the sea, and now they're terrified of Jesus. There's great fear, and the fear now is not of their circumstances. The fear is of the one who is before them. And when we think about that, again, it calls to mind a lot of instances in the Old Testament especially, but a few in the New Testament, when the presence of God is present among his people. You go back to Sinai, for example, just the first one that jumps to my mind. In Exodus 18 through 20 especially, where the people of Israel are gathered at Mount Sinai, and God tells Moses that they're to come near to the mountain, draw near to the mountain, and God's voice booms. And just from the voice of God and the lightning and thunder and the smoke that's rolling down the mountain, they're so scared, they tell Moses, "You talk to us, but don't let God talk to us anymore." On this occasion, Jesus calms the storm, and now instead of being excited because the storm is over, they look at the one who has such great power and they're immediately afraid. And they ask a question. And the English Standard Version says it this way: "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" I believe it's the King James and New King James versions that say, "What manner of man is this?" The other accounts, even in the English Standard, and probably I would believe in the New American Standard, for example, Matthew chapter 8, verse 27 is another account of this same event. And in the English Standard Version, at least on that occasion, it says, "What kind of man is this?" That's the real question that's being asked here. It's not so much who is this, like somebody calls and I would say, well who is this? The question is really, who are you? What kind of person are you that just speaking to the sea and the wind would cause it to stop? What manner of man is this? What kind of man are you that this would happen? They knew that God had this power. I mean, they could read the Old Testament, whether it's in the Psalms or whether it's passages like what we find in Job, when Job is being asked by God all manner of questions with regard to, well, were you here when this happened? Or did you do this? Or are you capable of handling this? And the implication of all of that, of course, is God is the one who did all those things. And so who is Job to be questioning him? The disciples knew that God was capable of that. And part of, I think, the fear here is that while they had some understanding of who Jesus is, some recognition of what he had come to do, they were still missing the key ingredient. And that is that God was standing in front of them in the flesh of a man. And it seems at least that they begin to recognize that here. They seem to begin to understand who he really is, or at least who they believe he must have to be, because they know who's capable of this. And the difficulty for them is seeing a man standing before them. And I don't mean any disrespect to Jesus, but for all accounts from what we read about Jesus in the Bible, a man standing before them and not really that impressive of a man. I mean, there wasn't anything about him. Isaiah, if I understand that passage in Isaiah 52 and 53 correctly, there wasn't really anything about Jesus that was especially impressive. Certainly his background wasn't impressive. There were a lot of aspects of his background that actually would have been questionable in the minds of many of the Jews. His economic status and station in life was not especially impressive. I don't know what his rabbinic school upbringing looked like. I don't know if he went as far as 12 like most of the other Jewish boys did, or went beyond that, or if he was taught mostly at home. But there was nothing about Jesus that was especially impressive. So they see what he does here, and their response is to think about it and to consider, we know who's capable of this, but him? Who are you? What have you really come for? And so I just submit that as we look at this text, that they're beginning at least to have some understanding of the greatness of the one who stands before them. And his greatness doesn't lie in what he looks like, or in his social station, or his economic status. And there's some sense in which they'd heard him teach, and certainly there were aspects of his teaching that were different than anything they'd ever heard before. But the impressive nature of the one who was before them wasn't even bound up just in that. There's much more to this individual than we ever really imagined. I hear them thinking and wondering about. What kind of man are you? Who are you? What gives you this kind of power that you're able to do that which we believe and know that only God is capable of? And it is that knowledge, I believe, that terrified them more than the storm. Here's the apologetic aspect of this. This gentleman in his book talked about the fact that Sigmund Freud, many of you have heard that name before, that one of the theories that he postulates is that man created God in order to deal with our fears of natural disasters, whether it's storms or earthquakes or volcanoes or whatever it is. That we created God to be a kind of crutch to help us through those kinds of things that we can't understand and that we're afraid of. The question this man posed in his book was that he wondered what Freud would do with the fact that the disciples were afraid of the storm, yes. But if they created this God, what they created was a God that they were more afraid of than they were afraid of the storm. Typically, if we were to create something to comfort us, we would hope to find comfort at the end of it. But the end result in this case is the one who was capable of calming the storm. Okay, the storm's gone. That should be a good thing. But now we're afraid of the one who did it. And so his question, he said he wondered how Freud would answer the fact that if we've created this God that the Bible reveals, why would we create a God who invokes more terror in us than the natural disasters that we've created him to help us deal with? And I thought it was a good point to make. And the reality is that we haven't created this God. We talked about this in our apologetics class when we were dealing with evidences. We wouldn't have created this God anyway. There's so many aspects of the nature of God, the God of heaven, the God of the Bible, that are different from every other form of theology and form of teaching that we find. Well, what about for us? Well, for us, as we look at this, I think the question becomes, whom or what shall we fear? And that is a thought that is repeated throughout Scripture. What should we be afraid of? In Matthew chapter 10, and beginning in verse 28, Jesus says, "And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." He goes on to give the illustration of the sparrows and God's concern for them, and to talk about how much more valuable than the sparrows we are. Whom shall we fear? And again, that's repeated over and over again. Psalm 27 is a passage that comes to mind. Romans chapter 8 is a passage that comes to mind as Paul talks about us being more than conquerors. But who should we be afraid of? Who should we be afraid of? And I bring this up in some ways because we're living in a climate that is growing more and more hostile toward biblical Christianity, just to put it in with a pretty fine point. Tolerance is one of the things that's preached and taught all over our society. We should be tolerant of all people. And yet the one thing that is not tolerated is the biblical view of Christianity. Now, where is that going to lead? I'm not a prophet, so I can't tell you. I don't know what the outcome is going to be for us as Christians. But I know that ultimately, if it comes to the point that we face some of the persecutions that are faced in other countries, we're going to have to decide who we're afraid of. Are we afraid of our government? Are we afraid of what people might say about us? Are we afraid of losing our jobs? Are we afraid of the threats that may arise? Or are we going to fear God and keep following him? I think it's easy for us in our freedoms that we experience in this nation to look at the biblical stories and say that we would we would be willing to die for Christ. I think it's easy for us to say that. But the proof is going to be in the pudding, so to speak. If things become more and more difficult for us to serve God in the way that the Bible reveals, as this country continues to devolve. And we've got to make our stance now, and we better be building a faith now that allows us to recognize that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that he is worthy of placing my faith in him, my trust in him, and worthy of serving, because he keeps his promises and because he is greater than anything we can face. The disciples were certainly going to face horrific things by the hands of their own people, at the hands of Gentiles, at the hands of rulers, in the days and years to come. And their faith at this point was still infantile. But they were going to need that faith, that understanding of who Jesus is, to help them to overcome those difficulties that they were going to face. And we're going to need strong faith in Christ if we're to stand the tests that may lie ahead for us as we seek to serve and honor God in the midst of a crooked and perverse world. And so, as Joshua said, choose for yourselves whom you will serve. Who are you going to serve? And again, it's easy for us to say, well, we're going to serve the Lord. What's going to happen as things grow difficult? Are we going to stand firm, or are we going to fear the storm? Are we going to fear the storm, whatever form that takes? We're going to fear the people who bring the storm, or are we going to fear the God who commands it? Where will you stand? Where will I stand? Where is my faith? Is my faith growing in the way that it needs to be? Am I going to honor God in the things that I do? If you're here this evening and in some way subject, come to the one who commands the storm. Come to Jesus, who was and is the incarnate God, who came and gave himself on the cross for your sins and mine, who has provided a way that you can be with the Father eternally. Come to him and recognize what Paul did in Romans chapter 8, and that is, if God didn't spare his own son, how will he not freely with him give you all things? How will he not provide everything you need, every strength, every answer, and ultimately every promise? If you're here this evening in subject, please come while we stand.